Hello, everybody, and welcome once again to The Sacred Life. I am excited to be with you here this evening. I have put together a presentation here that I hope you will all find very edifying. We're going to be talking about icons. Specifically, we're going to be talking about the Second Council of Nicaea and some of the claims that are set forward concerning the Second Council of Nicaea. What I'm really interested to look at is this claim that the justifications or explanations or what have you in Second Nicaea were just kind of justifications made up after the fact, or that these aren't really apostolic principles, and they're inventing some kind of new and strange doctrine, or coming up with some kind of strange argument or some kind of weird sophistry. The best way to introduce this argument is the now famous or infamous, depending on what side of the debate you are in, quote from Gavin Ortland, where he says in one of his videos that kind of ignited the controversy that's going on right now. He says, icon veneration developed later, and it isn't apostolic. It's an accretion that risks idolatry. The early church avoided image to honor the invisible God, and the Orthodox defense, like honor passing to the prototype, are post hoc rationalizations that contradict the second commandment's plain reading. So that might seem like a reasonable... I've probably got my microphone too far away from here. Sorry if you're not hearing me. But that probably sounds like a reasonable kind of counter-argument against the Orthodox position at first. But we're really going to be diving into that claim because we think there's a lot wrong with that claim. You might have some sympathy for it at first glance, but let's really dive into that. So the first thing I'm going to say is you actually shouldn't venerate icons. You shouldn't bow to them or kiss them or any of those things. And as an Orthodox Christian, I personally have never done that. I have never actually venerated an icon. I've never bowed down to an image because I venerate the saints. I pay honor to them and the glory of God that works in their lives and how God accomplishes the salvation of the world and of my own soul through them. An icon is nothing but paint on a piece of wood. We'll see that argument stated pretty explicitly by the church fathers, or plaster on a wall or ink on a piece of paper. When we behold the icons, our minds ought to not to be focused on those things that are in front of us, but to that which they represent. And in our hearts and with our words, we pay honor to God in his saints. And now this is essentially the argument of the Second Ecumenical Council, the argument of figures like St. John of Damascus, St. Theodore the Studite, and others like that. Again, apologies. In my setup, I didn't have my microphone in position. I had it kind of out of the way while I was doing the initial kind of setup work here. So sorry about the bad audio at the beginning there. My apologies again for that. So I want to look at this idea because I think for a lot of Protestants, this seems like something like a bold claim. They're looking at it at face value, and it's like, like the quote I read from Dr. Ortland, where, he's saying clearly this is an accretion, or clearly this is a later development, or all kinds of things like that. And, if you're going for what the Protestants claim to be a plain reading of the second commandment, we got to understand we're working with people who are operating from that paradigm. And a lot of us have been there ourselves. And so what we're saying, we're not bowing down to images. We're not kissing icons, or like we're not paying this veneration, I should say, to the icons. It's the honor passes through the image to the prototype. I could understand on the surface level how that might seem like a reasonable argument. So we're really going to dig into that. And what I would especially like to look at tonight, we'll get into that later, is how... I need to stop fiddling with things with my hand over here and dropping them and making noise. But how the more we learn about the human brain, the human mind, the more we learn about our cognitive instruments and the way that humans find meaning in the world, the more we learn actually the arguments set forward by St. John of Damascus, St. Theodore the Studite, the Seventh Ecumenical Councils. These are not sophistry. These are not post hoc justifications by any stretch. They're not what Dr. Ortlund thinks they are, but they actually wind up being incredibly sophisticated arguments that are increasingly vindicated by the science. So to kind of lay out that principle, first let's look at some analogies where there are other things in our lives where we sort of see this principle at work. And what the principle I'm especially focusing on here is the matter of attention. How attention shapes our experience of meaning, and how we find meaning in the things that we encounter, because humans, we'll get into this later, but humans really are fundamentally incapable of forming actual meaning from abstract concept and theories. We actually need something physical involved in our thinking and in our process, or we just really can't make any sense of it. So we're always doing this. I would say we're always doing what the Orthodox argue is going on with icons, whether we admit it or not. So the first analogy I would like to look at, I should have brought mine up here with me to demonstrate, is the action of praying with a prayer rope in the Orthodox tradition. And part of the reason why we do that is because this embodied physical action of fingering the knots while praying the Jesus prayer, it creates a sort of focus that is really pretty difficult for us to attain. You know, if we're trying to have this sort of like pure attention, where like the only thing that's real and that's valuable is what the mind does, and so there's no physical aspects of prayer. Well, for one thing, I'd say that's not actually a Christian idea. That idea comes from Plato. It doesn't come from anywhere in the scripture. You won't find that in the scripture. You won't find that in the ancient church. You will find that in the Gnostics. And it doesn't really appear again, largely until John Calvin and Ulrich Zwingli. But so this is one example, one analogy that the prayer rope in this case, is an embodied tool, or even something like the sign of the cross is a physical action where the physical action is itself a prayer. And the reason that's the case is because when we do this, we focus our attention on the action and what it represents. So those are some simple analogies. Another simple analogy is the action of telling stories around a campfire, how there's a physical setting, there are gestures involved with this. You know, the interplay of light and shadow and darkness has an effect on the story, and especially the way that you remember the story. So this demonstrates that there is absolutely a physical component to things like attention, to things like meaning and memory, and the way that we relate to them. And again, we're going to support these claims that I'm setting up with these analogies with actual cognitive science, and that's the part I'm really excited to get to. And then another thing is, like, we all realize, most of us do anyway, the value in having some kind of physical discipline in our lives, whether it be playing a sport or martial arts, or, you know, lifting weights and keeping our body in shape, going out and running, and how the health of our bodies, the physical condition of our bodies, is directly connected with, I guess you could say, the health of our minds, the health of our souls also. So our body and our minds are not like these fundamentally different things, but rather the human being is a composite being in which body and soul, or you could say body and mind, are always working together. They're not opponents. They're not enemies fighting against each other. Rather, the sort of conflict that's at play is keeping them in the proper relationship to each other. And that relates to the theology of icons. I hope that'll make sense as I continue to go through this. You know, to illustrate the concept of the prayer rope, keeping your attention focused, you know, which is also what icons, like the icons behind me, are doing when I'm praying. They help me keep myself focused on prayer. That's one of the things that they do. The prayer rope does that. Also, something like a fidget spinner is an example of the same principle at play. You know, fidget spinners actually aren't a terrible idea, because in this world that we live in, where things have become so virtual, things have become so detached, like just draw the contrast between somebody holding a prayer rope and keeping his mind, because he has this object in his hand, he's able to keep his mind focused on prayer instead of being distracted by his phone or something like that. So what I'm trying to draw out with these analogies, again, is the importance of a physical aspect in attention. This is a very important concept. So attention isn't passive. It's directly linked to embodied acts, and these embodied acts combat the mind wandering. You know, if you don't have an embodied practice, and this is one of the arguments that is really behind the practice of icons and why we put them all over our church, is because if you don't have an embodied practice, you know, the same argument also goes for just the practice of the liturgy and the way we Orthodox do our prayers in general. And again, things like the sign of the cross, is because if you don't have an embodied practice, if there's no physical element, it is virtually impossible to keep your mind from wandering, whether it be off the subject that you're trying to focus on, or whether it would be wandering out of reality into speculation, into abstractions that are not real. And so when your practice is not embodied, I would argue, and the fathers do argue, that your theology is not embodied. Your theology is no longer real. It is speculative and fake, and not, like, it has nothing to do with what is true and what is actual and what is lived. And so that's an important principle to lay down when you're understanding what we as Orthodox Christians are trying to communicate when we're defending the icons and the practice. And I think this is an important concept to kind of lay down when I'm going to be presenting this principle of honor passing to the prototype. So now, going on from that, I'm going to present the patristic arguments. So in particular, the three figures, or the three sources I'm focusing on here, are St. John of Damascus, St. Theodore the Studite, and the Seventh Ecumenical Council, the Second Council of Nicaea. What the theological statements that are made, or some of the theological statements. Obviously, I'm not going to present everything from the Seventh Ecumenical Council or everything from St. John of Damascus and his defense of the holy icons. They're rather large documents, but just presenting the key arguments that help me present the case that I'm trying to present here. So first, we're going to look at some core principles. So attention, like, it is an important element of our experience of meaning, of us drawing meaning from, let's say it's the stories or the sermons or what have you that we are engaging with. So you see the necessity of an embodied practice, even in the scriptures. So, like, we have things like Romans 12:1, where St. Paul says, present your bodies as a living sacrifice. John 1:14, we see the principle that the word became flesh. 1 Corinthians 6:19, the body is the temple of the Holy Spirit. And of course, I'm not going to go into tremendous detail on that here, but there's also this distinction between veneration, which we'll use the Greek words doulia or proskinesis, which is like honorable reverence being paid towards something, which is in the Bible not something that is exclusively directed to God, not something that is only given to God, but it is something that is also given to people. St. Paul talks about honoring and venerating the leaders of the church or the political authorities, as ministers of God, things like that. That's this principle. And then the distinction with latria as worship. We see that in Matthew 14, where he says, worship the Lord your God and serve him only. That is the word that's used there. Latria is also the word used in the Septuagint translation, the Greek translation of the Old Testament, in the second commandment, where it says, don't bow down to and serve idols. I guess proskinesis is also used there, but like the combination of the two is driving at the meaning. So presenting, I'm going to look at some of the patristic quotes. First, let's look at St. John of Damascus. Let me see if I can put this up on screen. I hope you can see that there. This quote from St. John of Damascus, where he says, of old, God the incorporeal and uncircumcised was never depicted. Now, however, when God is seen clothed in flesh and conversing with men, I make an image of God whom I see. I do not worship matter. I worship the God of matter, who became matter for my sake and deigned to inhabit matter, who worked out my salvation through matter. I will not cease from honoring that matter which works my salvation. I venerate it, though not as God. How could God be born out of lifeless things? And if God's body is God by union, it is immutable. The nature of God remains the same as before. The flesh created in time is quickened by a logical and reasoning soul. I honor all matter besides and venerate it, through which my salvation has come to me. Was not the thrice happy and thrice blessed wood of the cross matter? Was not the sacred and holy mountain of Calvary matter? What of the life-giving rock, the Holy Sepulchre, the source of our resurrection? Was it not matter? What of the ink and the holy book of the Gospels? What of the life-giving table which gives us the bread of life? Are not all these matter? Should they not be venerated? Surely. Now, I think some Protestants are going to have a little bit of issue with what he says there, but it does present the basic argument. But I want to compare that, because what I really want to do is present these arguments, which if you're working from a let's just say an idealist or nominalist Reformed Protestant paradigm, and this is the basis for your iconoclasm or your aniconism, we can say at least. I want to show you how the more we learn about the human mind and the human experience of the world and of meaning, the more your position actually is indefensible, the more it doesn't make sense. And so let's look at this quote from Ian McGilchrist. Let me put this up on the stage again, up on the screen again, where he says, attention is a moral act. It creates, brings aspects of things into being, but in doing so makes others recede. What a thing is depends on whom is attending to it, and in what way. The attention changes what kind of thing comes into being for us, and that way it changes the world. And that's the sort of thing that I think if a church father were saying that, a Protestant would have a lot of problems with it. But Ian McGilchrist, when he's saying this, I would recommend you just I'd highly recommend reading his writings, the Master and His Emissary, and the Matter of Things. I haven't read the Matter of Things yet, which is where that quote actually comes from. But he is building on this understanding of the connection of the right and left brain and the brain's sort of mechanism for attending to things and finding meaning from things and knowing its place in the world. And I'm connecting this here with what St. John is saying, because there's this principle at work here where, how do I want to say this? That let me think this through a little bit so I word it succinctly. That this embodied veneration of objects like I would argue, and I do argue, this embodied veneration of objects, such that Saint John of Damascus is discussing here, it's very powerful in terms of how our human experience works, how we find meaning, how we make meaning, create meaning, you might even say, and that the human mind sort of has this unique property in this way. And so, like a counter argument you often hear from Protestants against icons and relics, they'll point to that there were more pieces of the true cross scattered across Western Europe in the Middle Ages than, like, I think the saying that I always heard is from the time of the Reformation is that you could build a boat with all the pieces of the true cross, and so they're mocking this. But what I want to challenge you with is that because of this mechanism of attention, those relics, even if you're trying to say forensically that they're not really part of Christ's actual cross, as far as we encounter God through them and we form meaning from them, they're genuine relics in that sense. And so, I mean, this will make more sense later, I hope, as I kind of tie all these things together. I know a lot of these things you might wonder in my initial presentation how these actually relate to each other, but please bear with me if that's the case. My next quote here is from Saint Theodore the Studite. Let me put that up on the screen again. He says, "For the honor paid to the image passes over to the prototype, and whoever venerates the image venerates it in the hypostasis of the one who is inscribed. It is not the essence of the image which we venerate, but the form of the prototype which is stamped upon it. Since the essence of the image is not venerable, nor is the material which is venerated, but the form which has been impressed upon it, not the delineation which is seen, but the hypostasis which is imaged. And this hypostasis is venerable because it is divine. Therefore, the veneration of the image is veneration of the hypostasis. And the hypostasis is the prototype. Without the visible, the mind remains dispersed, unable to unite with the divine hypostasis." And then so here, obviously, we're wading right into the territory of the kind of things that in the quote that I read at the beginning from Dr. Gavin Ortland, this is the very sort of theology he is challenging. And so I'm presenting this argument from science and saying, no, this, again, at surface level, you might say, well, obviously you're praying to a piece of wood or you're venerating a piece of wood. Like, in the material sense, that's what you're doing. But what I'm hoping to draw out for you is that as far as it is anything to us as human beings, that doesn't matter. That is insignificant. It's meaningless, that argument, because that is not how humans experience reality. That's not how we shape meaning in our experiences. That's not how we encounter the world. How we encounter the world is that when I am venerating the icon, it might, in the strict material sense, just be paint on a piece of wood. But when I am venerating the icon, I am not venerating that piece of wood. That's not what I'm doing in any sense that is real. And this is what all of the cognitive science is showing us. So we see this from John Vervaeke, who's a cognitive scientist, and he's a professor of psychology at the University of Toronto. A lot of my audience is probably familiar with who John Vervaeke is. But he says about this, attention is the fundamental cognitive resource for meaning making. It's not just seeing, it's how we select and shape our world. Embodied practices like rituals train attention to align with deeper patterns, fostering relevance realization, the ability to discern what's truly meaningful amid the noise. So that really relates to what we're saying here, and also to what Ian McGilchrist said in the previous quote, that I read, and I hope it's now starting to all tie together. What I'm trying to say here is, again, I'll pick up a different one this time for sake of visual. I don't know, but when I'm venerating this icon, it's like I'm not like looking at it and like, wow, this is a really nice painting, and I'm really paying my respect to this painting. I mean, yes, like I can do that. I can. I mean, I'm not. I'm gonna be cautious about doing that right now because I'm the artist in this case, and I don't want to venerate myself. But even then, like when you're doing that, you sort of understand. You sort of understand how you're venerating the artist and not necessarily the art itself, or even if you are venerating the art itself, you're venerating what you see as the meaning of the art. And so this is what we're doing when we're venerating an icon. I don't see this as this is a piece of wood with gesso and paint and gold leaf on it. I see this as my attention in every way that actually matters, every way that is significant, is directed at the saint. In this case, in the case of the one I just showed, at St. Nicholas, towards St. Nicholas. I am thinking of St. Nicholas. My attention is directed towards St. Nicholas. The other one, St. George. Same with all of these, especially the icon of Christ up here, that when I am venerating this icon, my attention is on Christ. That's where my thoughts are. That's what this veneration is being directed towards. And again, you want to argue, if you're a Protestant, that this is a post hoc justification, but no, it's not. The cognitive science completely, I'm telling you, the cognitive science completely vindicates the Orthodox argument in this case. So let's continue with this. Here is a quote. I'm going to stop putting these quotes on screen. I'm not sure that's actually. I think it's just more distracting than it is actually helpful. If you guys disagree with me, let me know. Put up your suggestions in the chat, and I'll see that. But this is from the Horos, or the definition of the Second Council of Nicaea, which I hope some of you are in the chat that I kind of wanted to see these arguments. Some of the people I was debating with in the YouTube comment section or over on X, or whatever it might be, over the past week. But here's what the Second Council of Nicaea says relating to what we're talking about. It says, "For by so much more frequently as they, the icons, are seen in artistic representation, by so much more readily are men lifted up to the memory of their prototypes, and to a longing after them. And to these should be given due salutation and honorable reverence, not indeed that true worship of faith which pertains alone to the divine nature. But to these, as to the figure of the precious and life-giving cross, and to the book of the Gospels, and to the other holy objects, incense and lights may be offered according to ancient pious customs." Remember, ancient pious customs are saying here. In 787, they're saying this is an ancient custom, not a modern custom that we are introducing. "For the honor which is paid to the image passes on to that which the image represents." Again, that's St. Theodore's argument, also St. John of Damascus, his argument. "And he who reveres the image reveres in it the subject represented. If anyone does not venerate these images, let him be anathema. The mind does not remain with the materials because it does not trust them. That is the error of the idolaters. Through these materials, the mind ascends towards the prototypes. That is the faith of the Orthodox." So there's a lot to unpack in this quote, because there's a lot in this quote. I've included sections here that are some of the things that Protestant critics of Nicaea are really going to point to. I've already dealt with it. I hope in a good way, I've already dealt with these claims of the image passing to the prototype, and we're going to get into that in a lot more detail, especially in terms of cognitive science. And how this is, at this case, I'm just going to say it is objectively true. So this is not a justification. What we're going to see here as we go along tonight is that what the fathers are saying here in the council is amazingly astute, I guess you could call it amazingly astute understanding of how humans actually function. So the big thing that people are going to pull out and have controversies with, we have it here in the definition in the Horos. We also have it obviously in the anathemas issued by the council. But it says here, if anyone does not venerate these images, let him be anathema. And so, they're often going to point at this and say, see, look, you're saying, you're adding this to the gospel and saying, if you don't venerate the images, then you're accursed and you're going to hell. Okay, first of all, that's not what this means. That's not what an anathema means. And I know you're going to pull out other quotes, and even quotes from this same council to try to uphold that claim. I can deal with those later if we need to. That's kind of outside of the purview of this discussion. But what one thing I want to accomplish in this video, in this stream, is to demonstrate that this is this is not a dogmatic definition and statement, as in we've decided if you don't do what we're saying, you're anathema. That instead it's the other way. They're recognizing, no, this is fundamental to human experience, and if you don't do this, you are anathema, like by the nature of reality. I'm arguing that is actually what the fathers are saying. That is actually their point here. And we will see as we go through the science, as we go through what we are continuing to learn from the emerging the emerging cognitive science, that this position is very much vindicated. Jordan Peterson says something that kind of lines up with this in Maps of Meaning. He says, attention is the mechanism by which we construct our world. Embodied actions in ritual direct attention to archetypal patterns, creating order from chaos and meaning from suffering. Ignoring this leads to psychological disintegration. And this really goes especially with the last bit that I had read previously from St. Theodore the Studite, where he said, without the visible, the mind remains dispersed, unable to unite with the divine hypostasis. That, like, this is a this is a principle that we are understanding more and more. No, this is literally true, that without a mechanism of attention, your mind is scattered and you're unable to connect with meaning. And the Second Council of Nicaea recognizes this. They're saying, no, without the holy images, because God is matter, that's a misstatement. God is not matter. But because God has united with matter is what I meant to say. That, this is an integral part of our experience, and that, not doing so is a denial in a lot of ways of the incarnation. But that's not the primary focus of my argument here. We can go into that on other videos if we need to. But what I'm pointing to specifically is this idea, the necessity, like the absolute necessity of having a way in which your attention is embodied, or else you actually can't relate. Like, you reduce God to abstract concepts, and this is this is kind of what Jordan Peterson is illustrating, and also what the fathers in the quotes that we've read are illustrating. And especially this idea that there's an important distinction here in the Second Council of Nicaea, where they clarify the mind does not remain with the materials because it does not trust them. That is the error of idolaters. So this is a very important distinction, that an idol does not function. It's never seen to function in this way. Like, it's never seen that the idol is a representation of the God, and the honor that's given towards the idol passes through the idol to the God, but rather the idol is actually understood to be a body of the God. And when you're venerating, like, you are are literally venerating the idol, like and literally offering sacrifices to the idol because you believe that that idol is actually the god. Um, so we see. I mean, I read. I mean, I referenced this earlier when in John 1, where the word is becoming flesh, the word is embodied, God is embodied, God has united with our flesh. And this is in part why we point to this and say there's a necessity to embodied ritual that includes things like the liturgy, and it also includes things like icons. So I would say you can't really have a liturgical practice without icons. You just have pieces of liturgy without icons, um, because liturgy, what it is fundamentally, is the embodiment of attention and meaning. And the Eucharist obviously is like the ultimate fulfillment of this, where like the uh, the real presence of Christ, like Christ becoming literally present in the Eucharist. This is a very important concept, and there's a very important reasoning as it relates to human meaning and experience phenomenology. Why you're wrong if you don't think this is how it works. So we're going to be looking a little bit more at the philosophical alignment of the church fathers in their arguments, things like a phenomenology of attention, embodied experience, and meaning. And again, comparing that to the arguments of the church fathers. So again, attention forms meaning through embodied rooting. Phenomenology sees this as lived disclosure, and this aligns with this vision that we see in the church fathers that I mentioned, and in the Second Council of Nicaea, of the necessity of icons and the necessity of embodied ritual, which is something a lot of Protestants are going to point at this and say, "Look, this is a problem. Why are you saying this is necessary?" And we're saying it's necessary because this is a realization and an acknowledgement of reality. Um, so again, Saint John of Damascus is saying embodied attention is directed to the unseen. He says, "I make an image of the God whom I see. I do not worship matter. I worship the God of matter. I venerate it, though not as God." So again, the attention is not to the object. The attention is not to the icon. The attention is not to the wood of the cross. Um, Rather, it is to God. Um, and when we're saying things like the image passes, or the honor passes through the image to the prototype, or the icon is a window to heaven, these aren't nonsensical statements. These are true statements that are describing phenomenology, describing the pathways of meaning and attention in human experience. I like what Jonathan Peugeot says about this, where he says symbolism happens. Pay attention to symbols, to meditate, contemplate, and work through symbols, because they are the patterns through which reality reveals itself. In Orthodoxy, icons and rituals embody these patterns, directing our attention to the divine hierarchy and meaning. And I think I really like the way he summarizes this whole idea and packages it together in this very succinct way. I don't think I need to provide any more commentary about that. Another quote from St. Theodore on this same concept. We kind of read this already, but I'll go over it again. He says, "The honor paid to the image passes over to the prototype." And then he says, "Without the visible, the mind remains dispersed, unable to unite with the divine hypostasis." And along with that, I have a quote from Mathieu Peugeot, Jonathan's brother. I'm sure a lot of you know who this is, who these guys are. The gap that separates ancient cosmology from materialistic science is enormous. On the one hand, we may interpret reality exclusively with materialistic concepts, but on the other hand, we may interpret reality with a cosmology that is rooted in embodied symbolism and patterns. Symbolism is the language through which meaning is formed, repeated in heaven-earth duality, requiring attention to embodied experience. So he's presenting that kind of same argument. And again, looking at what Nicaea 2 says, where they says the honor which is paid to the image passes on to that which the image represents. The mind does not remain with the materials. Through the materials, the mind ascends toward the prototypes. And as a comparison to this, I have a quote from Fraser Watts, who is a theologian and a psychologist. Is a former reader in theology and science at the University of Cambridge. In his work, A Plea for Embodied Spirituality, he says embodied cognition counters mind-body dualism. And that's an important point, that there's not a dualism as in like this opposition between the mind and body. Embodied cognition counters mind-body dualism, recapturing the role of the body in religion. Rituals integrate intellect and sense for holistic spiritual formation. Attention, when embodied, becomes a pathway to meaning, transforming abstract belief into lived reality. And I like the way he says these things here. I like the way he kind of ties this all together. That's why I wanted to throw that quote in there. But you're seeing this same principle at work here, that this concept, again, I'm gonna stress this over and over again, because this is kind of the point of this video. This concept of the honor passing through the prototype, or passing through to the prototype, is, again, this is not a post hoc justification. This is reality. This is the way the world works. This is the way attention works, and we all actually understand this in certain contexts. We've heard the arguments, and we've made the argument so many times about things like the flag, and we honor the flag and salute the flag. We understand we're not saluting a strip of cloth, but rather we're paying honor to the country that it represents. Same thing, we've heard similar arguments. We've made similar arguments, and they're good arguments. That's why we keep making it about, you have a picture of your wife in your wallet and you kiss that picture. You understand it's not the photograph that you are thinking of and that your attention is directed towards. And I think maybe that's the key here in understanding this. And I know this isn't an argument original to myself. People like Jonathan Pageau makes this argument, but it's a very important distinction to understand. That when you're talking about honor, you should be thinking of this in terms of attention. The attention that you are paying to the image, that might be how we would say it today. The attention that you are giving towards the image. Like, you understand you're not paying attention to the image, you're paying attention to what is depicted. Or like you're paying your attention is to the country, and everything that the United States or whatever country you live in is to you, or the attention is to your wife or girlfriend or to your children or whoever is depicted in the picture. That's where your thought goes. That's where your heart goes when you are really venerating these things. You are venerating things in the way that we as Orthodox Christians define the concept of veneration. So this idea of the honor ascending towards that which is depicted shouldn't be like, you shouldn't think of it in like this magical kind of way, or the superstitious sense, or in like this highly technical sense, but you should understand that it is discussing, it's talking about this mechanism of attention and this mechanism of meaning. So looking more at the cognitive science and neurotheology, that's, a nice new field that's emerging. And I guess that's kind of what I'm doing here, is neurotheology. So maybe that will become what I'm known for in the future, as a neurotheologian. I don't know if I qualify, but I'm trying my best to represent the arguments and show how they vindicate our position. So cognitive science shows attention roots meaning, again, in embodied interactions. And this vindicates, the necessity that the patristic writers in the Second Council of Nicaea place on ritual and, things, again, I already mentioned this, the liturgy, the Eucharist, and the icons. And the rejection of this thing results in a splintering of, you could say, of your neural networks, your mind, your cognitive pathways. And this is really detrimental to your to your line of reasoning, and it causes your thinking to become disembodied, to become detached from reality. And so this will again be a criticism that we have of Protestant theology, is that it's speculative, it's detached from reality, it's all operating in this disembodied logic and reason, and like there's no coherence to it because it's scattered, it's not it's not embodied. So again, looking at what St. John of Damascus said, where he said, I venerate matter, though not as God, because he worked out my salvation through matter. This is kind of a paraphrase. And I'm going to compare this to a quote from Patrick McNamara, who is a neuroscientist and a professor of neurology at Boston University. This quote is from The Cognitive Neuroscience of Religious Experience. He says, religious practices, particularly embodied ritual, involve decentering and the self-activating prefrontal and dopaminergic circuits for belief significance, empathy, and narrative integration. So let me unpack that a little bit. That what he's saying there is that this kind of ritual embodiment of practice is activating these circuits in your brain that, sorry, my unpacking it is just saying it in the same terms that he is. I'm trying to simplify it to make it easier to understand, but I'm not very good at that. But that, like the meaning I would take away from this is that this embodied practice activates these neural pathways that are what is necessary for us to form a meaning, for us to relate to things in any kind of meaningful way. And I think that's what he's driving at with empathy and narrative integration. So like not only learning the details about these stories, but actually integrating them into ourselves. And so this idea of decentering, it says it involved decentering and the self-activating blah, 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 is like getting outside of your own reason and connecting with something else, and the necessity of physical practice, embodied practice in that. And so this use of physical objects in worship, it's not this evil sort of thing that you should you should think, oh, anything physical is bad. No, that's Gnosticism. That's not Christian. That's like Platonic disembodied theology. I'll go ahead and keep reading the quote here, though. He says, attention in these contexts is transformed, rooting meaning in communal and personal stories. Without such embodiment, religious knowledge remains underrepresented, leading to cognitive and emotional disconnection. That really strikes me in this quote, his connection that he's drawing to empathy and to emotional connection, where because I would argue you see that in a lot of these more rationalistic applications of the faith, and people who are really fixated in having all of the right ideas, all of the right definitions, that they begin to lack empathy. They become more concerned with being right and proving they're right and making sure everybody else is right than actually what people are experiencing, what people are going through, what's happening in people's lives. And I mean, just to put it bluntly, they kind of become jerks and tyrants. And we're going to get into that later, because I want to talk about the connection of this between the right brain and the left brain. Because what ends up happening is you create this imbalance where the left brain takes over, and it becomes like this kind of tyrannical reason that is completely disembodied and disconnected from reality. And like the use of physical and embodied practices and things like icons in your worship and prayer is necessary for keeping for keeping your reasoning rooted in reality, and for keeping how would I say this? Keeping the right brain connected and engaged, and keeping the left brain kind of in its proper relationship to the right brain in that sense. And then connecting with what Saint Theodore was saying, we kind of, again, I'm representing and paraphrasing these quotes just so you don't understand where I'm at. He says, without the visible, the mind remains dispersed. The honor paid to the image passes over to the prototype. So again, to look at Ian McGilchrist, who is a psychiatrist, a neuroscientist. He's a former Oxford literary scholar. And this is once again from The Matter of Things. He says, attention. Well, this is more or less the same. I mean, it's pretty much the same quote that I read earlier, but I'll go ahead and read it again. Attention is a moral act. It brings aspects of things into being, but in doing so makes others recede. What a thing is depends on whom is attending to it and in what way. And that's important, actually, when we're talking about icons. Is there's an element of that, is that what the icon is to you does kind of depend on the way in which you are attending to it. And you see that you see that illustrated. I don't know the Hebrew term for it, but the bronze serpent, and the way in which people attend to the bronze serpent drastically changes its meaning. And when people start attending to it as if it itself were the object, then it becomes an idol and has to be destroyed. And you see this also in the early church. Some of the quotes from early church fathers that people try to say are iconoclastic or aniconic are referring to this concept that the sort of attention that some people are giving to the icons becomes very pagan and idolatrous, truly idolatrous in the true sense, where they start paying attention to the icon. And when that happens, it's like, no, the icon is not what we're venerating. The icon is not what our attention is given to. And you know, when you start taking that, especially to the degree where you're giving worship to the object, then that is idolatry, and that is wrong, and that practice can never be tolerated. And that is, it's really relating to what Ian McGilchrist is saying here about what a thing is depends on whom is attending to it. So for us as Orthodox, an icon is not an idol because that's not the attention that we're giving to it. Yes, you can argue, and this has happened historically. We see instances of this again in the Fathers where icons become idols, but that doesn't mean icons are idols. It's just, again, it's a matter of attention. What is the attention that you're giving? What quality, what sort of attention is being paid? Who's paying this attention to it? So he says, yeah, again, what a thing is depends on whom is attending to it and in what way. The attention changes what kind of thing comes into being for us. And in that way, it changes the world. Yeah, I think I've said enough kind of on that. And then going on, he says, God is not understandable, not a thing. God can only be recognized by the right hemisphere, the hemisphere that sees the whole and tolerates ambiguity. Embodied practices like religious rituals engage this holistic attention, forming sacred meaning. Without them, left hemisphere dominance leads to a detached, fragmented reality. Yeah, and that's I definitely really wanted to bring that into the argument here, that this is kind of where I think the breakdown occurs between especially Reformed Protestants who have this hyper rational approach to doctrine and theology, and the Orthodox understanding of idols. And that maybe it is true that for Protestants, icons appear as idols, but that is not because of something that is intrinsic to the nature of the icon. Rather, it is a consequence of the way in which Protestants are attending to the world, or really in the way that they are not attending to the world, because they lack embodied practice. this is definitely very true of Reformed Protestant traditions, that there's not real embodied practice going on, that the way in which they worship God and learn of God and speak of God and even encounter God is only in abstractions, only theoretical, only in the realm of ideas. And I think they have kind of swallowed this Platonic idea that the world of ideas, or as Plato would say it, the world of forms, is what is really real, and so anything embodied is a distraction. Again, that is not a Christian idea. If you have that idea, that comes from Greek philosophy. It does not come from the Bible. It does not come from the church. So you should not allow that to inform your theology in any way. But where you lack, and this is getting at why I'm saying the church fathers are absolutely right in what they're saying about icons, because where you lack icons, where you lack embodied practice of any kind, then your mind and your perception of things becomes fragmented and detached from reality. And this has to do with the balance of the left and the right hemisphere, that the right hemisphere is really what should be the thing mediating your connection with reality, but instead the left hemisphere is, and the left hemisphere is not able to tolerate ambiguity, like Ian McGilchrist says here. It's not able to see, I guess I would say it's not able to see the whole picture. And instead it has to fragment everything and break everything down into pieces. And that's what is happening in these disembodied practices. This is what happens when you throw away the Bible. I'm sorry, I'm looking at the comments here and getting distracted. When you throw away the icons, is that, I mean, you really are anathema in a very real sense, because you're disconnected from what you need to remain rooted and grounded in truth. So going back to Nicaea 2, where they say the mind does not remain with the materials. Through the materials, the mind ascends towards the prototypes. Boy, I don't know how to read this name. I'm guessing it's like Swedish or Finnish or something like that, but I'll try my best. Veli Matti Karkainen. Sorry, I'm sure I butchered that, but this individual is a theologian and a professor of systematic theology at Fuller Theological Seminary. So this is not necessarily an Orthodox position, as far as I know. But this individual says an embodied cognition perspective as a new dimension in studies of religion complements previous research. Religious rituals synchronize behavior. Enhancing cognitive and emotional bonds essential for communal salvation. Attention, when embodied, becomes the bridge to relevance, aligning individual and collective focus. And I like to I like to connect that to I like to connect that with what John Vervaeke says about relevance realization, and the things that I've read previously in this stream from, Jordan Peterson, Jonathan Pizzo, and those figures about symbolism and meaning, and again, rooting that back to this idea of attention. But I like that quote because it does kind of demonstrate the principles that I'm working out, and how theologians increasingly, when they grapple with what we're seeing in the cognitive science, are coming to understand the Orthodox position and even defend the Orthodox position. And I think we're going to see more and more and more of that, especially as this research becomes more widespread, more available, more widely known and understood by the public. We're going to have less and less sympathy for the Reformed Protestant position on these things. So I'm going to kind of wrap up and then kind of address some Protestant and iconoclastic claims. Because iconoclasm, what it does is it prioritizes this abstract sense of purity over embodied reality. It's detached from cognitive and phenomenological truths. So it leads to exactly the consequences, the spiritual consequences that the fathers warned of. So again, the anathemas of the Seventh Ecumenical Council are not prescriptive, they are descriptive. They are saying, no, this is the way it is. And the reason you need to venerate the icons is because if you don't, you're anathema. Like you're, and by that I mean that you are disconnected from what's true and what's real. You're cut off from meaning, and you're going to start to fall into this understanding of yourself, understanding of the world, and especially this understanding of God and of worship that is just fragmented and chaotic. And if you want proof of that, just look at the state of the Protestant world. It is exactly that. It is exactly anathema. Like it has no, I don't know, like no congruity, no stability, nothing holding it together. It's fragmented. Um, it has no understanding even of itself. So let's look at some iconoclastic quotes here. First, from the Byzantine iconoclast. So this first quote here is from the Council of, I don't know how to say this, sorry, but Hieraria in 754 AD. So this is the iconoclast council that is overturned by the Second Ecumenical Council, the iconoclast council that was also condemned by the church outside of the Byzantine Empire. So this council, in case you don't know, was not well attended and very, very political. Like the emperor really forcing his doctrine on the church is what this council is. But what they say here is this is kind of an excerpt. It is an excerpt. It says, "The Christian is not to depict Christ or the saints in images, for this is idolatry. Scripture forbids graven images, Exodus 24. And the invisible God cannot be circumscribed by matter. Icons lead to confusion of natures and dishonor the divine." So I'm not in this stream, I'm not going to address all of the claims that they make here. St. John of Damascus pretty thoroughly addresses this idea of the uncircumscribable God being circumscribed. So it's like God is infinite, so you can't draw a circle around him. And St. John of Damascus upholds that, and the Seventh Ecumenical Council upholds that and say, yeah, that's true. You can't put a boundary around God, but that's not what we're doing when we depict God in images. What we're doing when we depict God or his saints in images is we're depicting God as he has revealed himself to us, and that's it. We're not depicting the divine essence. Like we're not depicting God in the fullest sense of what you might take that to mean. And so I hope with what I've read that you'll see that kind of the opposite of what the last line says here, where he says icons lead to confusions of nature and dishonor the divine, that in reality, the opposite of that is true, that the lack of icon leads to this sort of confusion and dishonor. And then also, like this, that's not the subject of this video, but the claim that the depiction of Christ or the saints as idolatry is just substantially untrue. This argument, again, flies in the face of research like what we've referenced from Ian McGilchrist and his hemispheric model of the brain. I wish I had time to go more into detail on that into that specifically, because I really like that. That's something that really fascinates me. But it shows that embodied practices, again, engage holistic attention for meaning, for formation of meaning. Iconoclasm's rejection risks left brain detachment and cognitive fragmentation. So the Iconoclast Council is operating strictly in this sense of disembodied theory. And so it's that it sort of starts out with this sort of error and then reinforces this error. And this line of thinking will lead, they didn't understand the consequences of their theology and never really got to experience it, but we definitely are experiencing that today. So this is confirmed by studies on the neural benefits of ritual. So, for example, Andrew Newberg, who's a neuroscientist and director of research at the Marcus Institute of Integrative Health at Thomas Jefferson University, and he points out that rituals enhance brain plasticity for spiritual integration, and abstract worship limits this. Yeah, and I think that in itself, if you want to reference that, the work is Principles of Neurotheology. But that in itself, I think, is a pretty powerful quote supporting the Orthodox position. Next, I'm going to look at Ulrich Zwingli, the Swiss reformer and theologian, from his writings on images. He says, the Christian life, then, is a battle so sharp and full of danger that effort can nowhere be relaxed without loss. I mean, that, so far, so good. Images are to be removed from churches, as they foster superstition and detract from pure worship. So again, this is Platonic philosophy. This is not Christianity. This is detached from Christianity. It's detached from reality. The concept at work here is that what is spiritual, and what is, I guess you could say, of the mind, what is detached from the body, is what is true and what is good. And so you could say you're setting up this Gnostic sense of detachment, but I think it's fair to say it's Platonic. And this is a theology that is thoroughly rejected by the church fathers. This aspect of Plato's theology, and if you doubt that, just read Saint Maximus the Confessor's chapters on theology, or yeah, that's probably the best one, because he deals with these concepts pretty directly. But you see just a complete disconnect and incongruity with Zwingli's view from what we actually know about cognition, what we know about neuroscience, how the science shows pretty much the exact opposite, again, of what Zwingli is saying. This conflicts with what figures like, again, John Vervaeke are saying about relevance realization, where embodied rituals actually train attention instead of being a distraction, like Zwingli's trying to say, or a detraction, I guess he says. This anti-image and anti-embodiment stance from Zwingli is, like, you're going to create a place where your mind wanders, either in the sense that you think of in the modern sense, when you're thinking of your mind wandering, you're not paying attention to what's going on, but also in the more abstract philosophical sense, where your mind is detached from any solid grounding and wanders off into speculation. And pretty soon you arrive at theological and philosophical conclusions that just have nothing to do with reality. And there are studies on prayer and meditation that show that physical anchors reduce the cognitive load by 20 to 30%, which is pretty significant. We have another quote here from John Calvin. We all know who John Calvin is, and this is from Institutes of the Christian Religion. And he says, we believe it wrong that God should be represented by a visible shape, because he himself has forbidden it. And it cannot be done without some degree of dishonor to his majesty. So I'm going to stop there and say, there's a sense in which what John Calvin is saying here is correct. That, the Orthodox Church is going to say, this is dogma in the Orthodox Church, that you do not depict God the Father in an image, and you cannot make an image of God in the sense of the divine essence. So what John Calvin is saying here, how he starts off, is true if that's how you intend it. And when we depict Christ in an image, we're depicting God's incarnation and not the divine essence of God. Images are unbecoming representations of God, and hence, whenever they are set up, superstition follows. And again, the cognitive science doesn't support what John Calvin is saying. It's saying pretty much the opposite, that images and embodied practices are actually going to root your practice in reality, root your thinking, keep you connected. And so this is John Calvin's reasoning here is itself an example of disembodied thinking. But then it kind of becomes like this vicious cycle where it causes your thinking to become even more disembodied. So yeah, this is going back again to what I was demonstrating for me in McGilchrist with the right and left hemisphere, embodied attention, sort of throwing the right hemisphere out of the mix, which is like, that is a criticism I have of Protestantism. That is like, it is excessively left brain, and that's bad. It's this tyranny of reason, which might sound good at first until you realize that reason has nothing to do with reality. Reason is disconnected with reality, and reason will just like put itself in a box and cut itself off from the real world when it encounters things that it can't understand, it can't explain. And then I have a quote here from R.C. Sproul. I'm gonna say R.C. Sproul because I want to say that. He says the second commandment regulates the way we worship God. It prohibits the making of graven images for the purpose of worship. I mean, kind of. That's kind of what's going on in the second commandment. There's a bit more to it than that. That's an extremely surface level reading of the second commandment. That's kind of detached from context, like from the broader context, not only of what's going on in the book of Exodus, what's going on in the Old Testament as a whole, but also what's going on in the world around them and in the world that they just came out of. But going on, he says, this commandment forbids the use of images in our worship of him. No, it doesn't. That's a misreading, as they dishonor his majesty and lead to idolatry. I want to see, when people make claims like this, this is disembodied logic, and I want to see you actually substantiate these claims with evidence. Actually, so, I mean, here, what I'm trying to do is substantiate the Orthodox claims and say, look, the cognitive science vindicates our position. And I would argue history vindicates our position. And you're making these statements, and you can claim that you're justifying them from the Bible, but I can justify my claims from the Bible too. I mean, I know I haven't done that in this video, but that's not the focus of this video. So forgive me if you find that offensive. But if you're making claims like this, like, I want to actually see evidence. I want to see you actually back these things up and not just present these statements, like demonstrate how this mechanism functions. Because again, I can demonstrate to you how the Orthodox mechanism functions. I can demonstrate to you how the fathers of the Seventh Ecumenical Councils laid out brilliant philosophical principles that are demonstrated from the science. Like we can show how these aspects of the council that you want to criticize and you want to complain about, we can show how these actually work out in the real world, how they actually describe something that's true and real. Whereas I am claiming what R.C. Sproul here is saying, R.C. Sproul is saying is like, it's disembodied and it's real and it's abstract, and you can't vindicate it. You can't support these claims. Another quote I have from John MacArthur. He says, any kind of picture, statue, or engraving is forbidden. I'd like to see you support that, substantiate that claim. Those who make icons and those who worship them are both an abomination to God. God is spirit, and those who worship him must worship in spirit and truth, without physical representations. So So what I'm trying to demonstrate from quotes like this is just to show you the disconnection, the complete incongruity between what these iconoclast Protestant scholars and teachers are saying with what we see in cognitive science, what we see in lived reality. So it is this, we're ignoring, like his, he says spirit and truth, but what he gets at here is really just a spirit only kind of worship. And again, this Platonic sense of worship. And by Platonic, like I have to qualify, like it's strictly like what you see in the late writings of Plato and things like Plato's Laws, and then especially Neoplatonism, but also Middle Platonism. I guess this is true of Middle Platonism as well. But so this paradigm, this way of thinking, ignores non-rational embodiment, and the cognitive science shows that we need objects, we need embodied practice, or our minds, our thinking, our worship is just detached, and we actually can't formulate any actual meaning or any actual experience from it. And like I would argue, you're actually, and this is something I can say from experience, is like you're struggling to have any kind of meaningful attention to the divine when you're worshiping in this kind of worship. And so you have to reduce your devotion to the divine to just a bunch of abstract ideas and adherence to a bunch of rules. And this is what you think is worship to God, even though God himself says he hates that. And then a quote here from James White, who says, "The veneration of icons is a form of idolatry that dishonors the invisible God. The second commandment clearly prohibits graven images in worship." Yeah, it does prohibit graven images. Icons aren't graven images. And Orthodox arguments for passing honor are sophistry that confuses the creature with the creator. So what I hope I'm demonstrating tonight in this video is that this criticism of our argument is unsubstantiated, and that this is not sophistry. This is something that we can demonstrate. This is a very real principle. This is something that very much happens. And if you're passing it off as sophistry, I'm going to say either there's a desire on your part to not actually genuinely engage with our arguments because you've already passed judgment, or you are not understanding what we're saying. And but probably what's going on is you're really approaching the whole debate, the whole question, in this extremely detached, disembodied, hyper rationalistic way of thinking. And so you can't comprehend how this subject holds up, or how these claims hold up, when you're dealing with them only as rational arguments, even if we've successfully demonstrated time and time again that you can understand these how these principles work out in your life in everyday practice. But it's like you're unable to connect the dots because you're not able to connect the dots because you've completely fragmented in your own mind, and you have this left brain tyranny that is just detached and is not able to connect things together, because that's what the right brain does. That's a lot of what I think is going on in Protestant arguments against the Orthodox positions. I have another quote here from Tim Challies. I don't know if that's how you say his name. I'm sorry, I've mispronounced names. I'm terrible at that. But he says, "Idolatry is worshiping the created instead of the creator. Any physical representation in worship risks turning our attention to the futile, the empty. Images distract from pure spiritual devotion." So I'm really seeing a constant theme here where what's seen as true worship is pure spiritual devotion. And I brought this up several times, but like I didn't even do that on purpose when I was drawing out these quotes here. I was just trying to find some quotes that uh, demonstrate these arguments. But to me, it's really a disturbing pattern that so central to the Protestant argument is this idea that the only valid form of worship is disembodied worship, is spiritual worship. And they'll always point to this passage that we encountered in a previous quote, where those that worship, God is a spirit, and those that worship him in spirit and in truth. And they always conflate that to, again, this Platonic concept, and like this Platonic concept that what is true and what is good are the pure forms, and anything of the body, anything physical, anything of matter is a distraction from that. And again, I'm really pushing back against that idea over and over again, because for one thing, it is an idea that is alien to Christianity. It's like kind of like the earliest heresy that the church was combating was this pagan idea, this Hellenic idea trying to invade Christian thinking. And it happened again with the Reformation. This Hellenic idea, it keeps popping up again and again and again. And it's so pervasive in especially Reformed Protestant thinking, or so like anybody with an evangelical or fundamentalist or even like charismatic kind of thinking, this will be so pervasive and so central to their way of thinking. But it's just thoroughly unchristian, but it's also just thoroughly wrong and not real. It's just detached from reality, and none of what we understand about the human being supports this claim. And important to understanding that, I thought I had this quote in my outline, but I seem to have left it out. But I'll just paraphrase it. Is St. John of Damascus, in his exact exposition of the Orthodox faith, is explaining this, how the human being is not a spiritual being, and the human being is also not a carnal being. Rather, the human being is a what's the word I'm looking for? Like the human being is both of these things. It's sorry, I can't think of the word. It's an obvious word. I feel dumb not being able to think of it. But composite being. Like the human being is a composite being of body and spirit. And so any true worship and any true experience and any true attention or encounter with meaning for a human has to necessarily involve the whole of ourselves. And what is happening in the philosophical principles that are underpinning all of these Protestant arguments against icons is you're detaching the two. And with John Calvin, this goes as far as him directly saying the body is a prison of the soul that we will escape at death. And that is not a Christian idea. Again, that is a Platonic idea that is imported from Greek philosophy. It's not us. It's not what Christians ever believed. But these kinds of ideas are so central to the iconoclast argument, and it's one of the reasons why I think, as a good Christian, you should flee these arguments. You should flee this way of thinking, because it has nothing to do with Christianity. All of the underpinning philosophies that are behind the arguments you're hearing or the arguments you're making, they come from somewhere outside of Christianity, and they're causing you to tragically misread the Bible and read things into it that aren't there, and defy concepts that are very, very important. And again, I read this quote at the beginning, but I'll recap it from Dr. Gavin Ortlund, because this is kind of the quote that kind of launched this whole current debate that's going on with icon veneration. He says icon veneration developed later, and it isn't apostolic. It's an accretion that risks idolatry. So he's kind of presenting the same sort of argument that you saw in these other Protestant teachers, maybe trying to be a little bit more diplomatic about it, but it is basically the same line of thinking. The early church avoided images to honor the invisible God. And Orthodox defenses, like honor passing to the prototype, are post hoc rationalizations that contradict the second commandment's plain reading. And I hope, if you've been with me from the beginning here, that you see this, you see my argument coming full circle here. How I told you at the beginning, Dr. Ortland's argument here is detached from reality, and it's detached from everything that we know about the human person. And the more and more we learn, the more we realize this is not a good argument, and that this is not a post hoc rationalization, but it is the church fathers understanding something integral to human nature and speaking from that understanding. Maybe we have become detached from that understanding because of the rise of nominalism and rationalism in Western culture, and especially in this increasingly virtual world that we live in, that makes these concepts harder and harder and harder every day for us to really connect with and understand. Which is, hey, incidentally, why we need more embodied ritual practices in our worship, is so that we can reground ourselves in what is real, especially in light of this, this world where we all have a distraction in our pockets all day long that is constantly screaming at us to pay attention, direct our attention to it. Like it's nice if we can have something that grounds our attention. It demands our attention in the way that our cell phones do, in the way that the internet does. Something that, instead of fracturing our attention and fracturing our person, heals us and draws us together and binds us together. And we need, that's why we need icons. That's why without icons, you are anathema. It's because without icons, without embodied ritual, without all of these things, you're scattered, you're fractured, you're in a million pieces, and you can't figure out how to put all those pieces back together. And your entire religious experience is trying to figure out what to do with all the broken pieces and where they belong. And half of them, you can't figure out what to do with them, so you just throw them in the trash bin. But that's not what you have in Orthodoxy, and icons are an integral part of why that's the case. I think that's what I got from my presentation tonight. I want to look through your comments a little bit here and see if there's anything that I should address. Toll House Boys. Put this up here. I just want to shout that out real quick and just say, hey, I'm actually not sure who you are, and I apologize for that. Maybe I should know that, but I'll check you out, and well, let's definitely be in touch. I need to. I don't know if I have the email for the Sacred Life in the descriptions of the videos. They used to be there, but they might have come out. If not, I'll try to remember to put that in the comments section. But if you know a way to get a hold of me, just go ahead and do so. I always forget to mention that we have channel memberships now. If you appreciate what I've done here tonight, or what we do here at the Sacred Life, please consider joining our channel as a member and helping support us, so that we can continue to do stuff like this, and hopefully even better than this. And we have super chats available as well. That's another way you can do that. I am an iconographer. These are all my own works surrounding me, behind me, and they're also all. In a sense, for sale. You can order icons from my website. That's in the description. I really appreciate if you do that. That would really help out. Again, what we're doing here, that help me out, help support kind of our goals and our missions. We also have our upcoming animation project. Working on developing the trailer for that right now, and then doing some crowdfunding and some fundraising. If you'd like to help support that at this stage, the best ways to do that are to support us either as a channel member or through super chats. We have super chats open, or purchasing icons. We also have a Patreon. You can support us on Patreon. And if you want to support us some other way before we have our actual crowdfunding fundraisers, let me know and I'll share. I don't know if they're in the descriptions right now, but I could share our Venmo and PayPal as well. I don't want to just be asking everybody for money, but rather these are helping support projects that we think are going to be beneficial for all of us as Orthodox Christians, for growing the Orthodox faith, helping more people to understand it and connect with it in a real way, especially with our animation project telling the stories of the lives of the saints. I will come back at some point and put all the references, especially from the scientific literature, in the descriptions, so you can look those things up for yourself if you want to. Somebody asks, is God a passionate God or a dispassionate God? The Orthodox teaching on that is very much God is a dispassionate God. God can't be moved, because God is absolutely sovereign. God is God. I'm not sure what you're thinking in that question there. I hope I've answered it correctly. Yeah, most of your I enjoy your comments here. Would like to thank AJ for joining as a new member. Appreciate that. And Atlee is a friend of mine. He's a good guy. If anybody else knows him, he's a great guy. You should. But thanks for your donation. Appreciate that. Other than that, if nobody else has any questions, I'm going to be wrapping up here. I've been going for a while. This is longer than I usually do my streams, but I had a big topic that I really wanted to get to and get through tonight. I think my voice is about worn out. It is worn out. So that's it for tonight. I would like to thank you all for joining us. Hope this has been beneficial. I hope this is as exciting to you as it is to me, this subject and the kind of the topics, especially with the neuroscience and cognitive science that we're talking about. Maybe in the future, I'll try to boil this down and distill it into a more succinct argument, but I think it's useful to have like the whole thing out there. And hopefully, if you're watching this as somebody who is Orthodox, this helps you have some more, I guess, tools in your tool chest, some more weapons in your arsenal when you're engaging with these debates with Protestants who are trying to say we're a bunch of idolaters and things like that. If you are somebody inquiring into Orthodoxy, or somebody who's just trying to approach the Orthodox doctrines, the Orthodox Church, with some amount of openness and honesty, I hope this helps answer a lot of questions. I hope this helps clarify how it's not fair and it's not accurate to say that the things that we're saying are sophistry, or the things that we're saying are equivocation. And hope that this helps clarify the point that I'm always trying to make, that is that what's going on here in our disconnect and understanding each other is a tremendous divide, a huge difference in terms of philosophy that underlies our conclusions. And speaking of that, there is a comment here that I wanted to get to. This guy was saying, "Dude is anti-Plato," and that seems to really upset you. I'm sorry if that's upsetting to you. Plato, the church's relationship to Plato is interesting because we have a lot of respect for Plato. And, we'll point to Plato and Aristotle and the Greek philosophers kind of in general as an important process of leading the Greeks and the Romans and the world ultimately to Christ. And what they did, we think there's a large degree to which they were moved by the Holy Spirit to do what they did. But at the same time, we also think that Plato was wrong in his theology. He was wrong in his understanding of these things that we're talking about. And so you'll see these specific things about Plato that I'm pointing to tonight frequently criticized in the church fathers, even if at the same time we can hold a lot of honor and respect for Plato as a person. And I hope that makes sense to you. That's all I've got for tonight. I'm going to wrap up now. Thanks again, everybody, for joining us. And I'd like to wish you all once again peace in Christ.